So today we're going to pick up, we've been going through the different phylums, and yesterday we talked about the classes of fish and the class amphibian, and today we're going to talk about reptiles and birds. So reptiles and birds sometimes are looked at as sort of like a branch of reptiles because they share many common features with reptiles, although they have some very distinct features as well. But birds and mammals and reptiles are all what are called amniotes. Now an amniote is something that makes amniotic eggs. An amniotic egg is an egg that has internal membranes and it can survive on land, it doesn't dry out, and it basically has everything that the embryo needs to develop in its own little perfect watery environment. So this is a major advancement of the reptiles over the amphibians because they didn't have to return to the water in order to reproduce. They could lay their eggs on land and the eggs don't dry out. And you're familiar with eggs, like chicken eggs. Same concept. Most reptile eggs are more leathery in their shells and the chicken eggs are harder in their shells. But they are still amniotic eggs and they share several parts. So there's a bunch of parts labeled here. We're going to go through 4 main parts. So first, the amnion. So the amnion is a fluid-filled sac, and this is where the embryo is found. And if you look here, let me just circle it on the drawing. So this is the amnion. And this is, we have an amnion in a human, we have an amnion as well. When we have the baby develop inside of us in the placenta, the amnion is the amniotic fluid here surrounds the baby, and it bathes them and it protects them as they develop. The second step, or portion here, is the yolk sac. Now, we don't have a yolk sac, obviously, in our uterus to develop a baby. We have a placenta with an umbilical cord, and that actually feeds the baby from the mom directly. But reptiles and birds have a yolk sac, and the baby actually gets all of its nutrition from there. So when you're eating an egg, the yolk of the egg would, if you weren't eating that egg, and it was a fertilized egg that was going to actually develop into a chicken, that yolk would be gone by the time the chick hatched because it would be using that as its food. So that's our first 2 parts. The embryo obviously is here developing, and we've got our amnion right around it, and then we've got our yolk sac that feeds it. All right, the next thing is the chorion. And the chorion, so that's this outer membrane here. So when you're asked on the test to label or match amnion versus the chorion, so the amnion, notice, is just around the embryo. The chorion is around everything. And this, its main job is to exchange gases with the atmosphere. So oxygen gets dissolved and goes in to give the embryo, developing embryo's cells oxygen, because it is made of cells and it still needs oxygen. And carbon dioxide is expelled. Again, in a human or a mammal that has internal development of a baby in the uterus, we actually exchange gases, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, through that umbilical cord. So the baby is actually getting all the things that they need from us rather than directly with the environment outside. And then the allantois. Now the way you'll tell the allantois from the yolk, notice how the allantois is fused with the chorion, which is why they mention the allantois as being part of what helps with gas exchanges, because it's actually fused with the chorion. But the main thing that it does is it collects waste. So this is the allantois here collecting the waste. This is the yolk, but notice the yolk is not actually attached here like the allantois is. So, and again, in a human, the baby's liquid waste would get filtered back to the mom through, again, that umbilical cord. So this amniotic egg, which is found in reptiles and birds and the simplest mammals, like the duck-billed platypus actually lays eggs, this is a huge development for living on land. It doesn't have to be laid in water. It doesn't dry out. It has its own little nutrient-rich environment. It's got a way of collecting waste. It's got a way of exchanging gases with the environment and food for the embryo. Everything is there so that the embryo can develop. So reptiles, this is our first group that uses the amniotic eggs. They include lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodilians, which is your alligators, crocodiles, caimans, all of those. And then also the dinosaurs were considered to be reptiles. Now, another thing that reptiles have that's an advancement over amphibians is that reptiles have a waterproof skin, and it's coated with a layer of keratin. So they usually have a thick keratin layer that makes them waterproof, and it prevents them from drying out. Amphibians, if you recall, most of them had a moist skin, and they actually relied on the skin as part of their gas exchange because their lungs were not extremely well developed. When we dissected the frogs today, you should have seen that their lungs were these little tiny, spongy, shriveled up sacs. But in a reptile, and a bird, and a mammal, you would see that they're much more well developed. So the reptiles do not have to rely on breathing through their skin. They only use their lungs. Also, reptiles are ectothermic. Now, so are the fish, and so are amphibians. So when we mention ectothermic, it's not like these other organisms we've already talked about. Technically, all of the invertebrates are ectothermic. Fish, amphibians are ectothermic, and reptiles are also ectothermic. Now, what that means, they don't have the ability to control their body temperature internally. So they, a lot of times, so no internal control of their body temperature, degrees Fahrenheit. Their body temperature basically just fluctuates with their environment. So in order for them to warm up, that's why you see lizards, for example, they'll go bask on rocks in the sun. If it gets too hot, they'll move to the shade. They may bury themselves. They may go into shady or caves or places like that. And they're trying to regulate their body temperature. It's not that they wouldn't have the ability to make their own oxygen. Make their own heat. Because technically they have muscles. And the way you mainly generate heat is by your muscles. And like shivering, for example, generates heat. Any kind of exercise generates heat. But the thing is, they don't have that internal thermostat in their brain that would tell them, hey, your body temperature is dropping too low, generate some heat to warm you up. If they had that, they have the other mechanisms in place. They have arteries and veins that they could make bigger or smaller. They have muscles, but they don't have the ability. So sometimes this is called cold-blooded, but be aware that if somebody was to say, hey, what's ectothermic mean? Don't say cold-blooded, because that implies that their blood is cold. That's not true. Their blood is going to be the temperature of pretty much their surroundings, because they're going to move to different areas and they're going to try to keep themselves warm. If they get too cold, like iguanas, in the winter sometimes if it gets really cold in Florida, they'll fall out of the trees. They get so cold, they're not dead, but they get so cold that they can't move very well. They get very stiff and they just go into almost like a dormancy, like a sleep, to conserve energy until it warms up again, and they literally just fall out of the trees. So the other thing is reptiles and amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. Now this is also an advancement over the 2-chambered heart. So the 2-chambered heart in a fish is a simple pump. It has an atrium, it has a ventricle, the blood passes through, and it goes all the way around the body to the gills, picks up oxygen, to the rest of the body, dumps off the oxygen for the cells, and then that blood goes back to the heart. So it's a very simple pump, it's not very strong, and it has to get the blood all the way around the body. It's a long distance. But remember, fish live in water. So pumping blood they're not fighting gravity like we are on land. A 2-chambered heart would not be sufficient to keep us alive on land, vertebrates like us. So the 3-chambered heart is an advancement. It's got 2 chambers on the top, but only 1 on the bottom. So really it looks something like this, and there's 2 chambers here. They're called atria. The blood comes in both of the atria, but then it mixes together in the ventricle. So there's like a valve here and a valve here, and this blood mixes together. Now, when the blood comes in and it goes back out again, so here's what happens. Now, the blood does not leave the heart and have to go all the way to everywhere and come back. The blood is actually going 2 different places. So if you look here, this is the ventricle, and this blood, when it leaves the ventricle, it goes specifically to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Now this blood, notice there's nothing blocking the side with oxygen from the side without, so they mix together a little bit, even though technically this side has the deoxygenated blood coming in, but it doesn't stay completely separate. So what ends up going to the lungs is sort of partially oxygenated blood. It comes back to the heart, goes back to that ventricle on the other side. Again, it mixes a little bit, and then it goes to the body. So this is like a double pump, because it's not sending the blood to the lungs and the body. It's just sending the blood either one place or the other. So it doesn't have to travel as far. That's reptiles and also amphibians. Birds and mammals have a 4-chambered heart. So we're going to come back to that later, but here's the cool thing about the 4-chambered heart. It completely separates blood with oxygen from blood without oxygen, which means what's going to go to your body here out of this ventricle is going to be blood that's fully oxygenated, has as much oxygen as possible. So your body cells are going to get the maximum amount of oxygen. Then that blood's going to go back to the heart, and on this side, it's just going to get pumped to the lungs. So it's going to go to the lungs, pick up oxygen, come back, and then the fully oxygenated blood's going to go to the body and then come back. So you have a full double pump that separates oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So this is a big benefit for birds and mammals. This is just some examples of reptiles, snakes, and lizards. You guys are familiar with my bearded dragons that I have in the room. I'm going to skip this little snake video and move on to birds very quickly. So birds, be aware, not all birds can fly. That's like a trick question. Most can fly, but not all of them. Penguins don't fly. Ostriches don't fly. But their bodies do have adaptations for flying. One, they have feathers. Some feathers are for flight. Some, the down feathers, are for keeping them warm. They have hollow bones. That makes them more lightweight than our bones or reptile or even fish bones, and that allows flying. And they have this thing, the keel. Now, penguins don't sit like this, so they actually, one of the reasons they can't fly is that they don't have this keel tilted the way it is, and so they're not really developed for flying. They're actually developed more for swimming. And this is the breast muscles. So when you eat chicken breast, the reason why it's interesting comment, why it's white meat, but in a duck it's not, it's dark, is because most chickens don't fly. We've bred them genetically so that they're so fat and big and they just can't. They can barely get off the ground. So they don't really use these muscles, which means there's not a lot of blood vessels in those muscles, and so this ends up being white meat, this and the wing. But in birds that do fly, that's not going to be as light meat because it's going to have more blood vessels in it. So just fun fact. Birds are endothermic, so birds and mammals. This is going to be a benefit and a drawback. So the benefit of birds over reptiles, number one, they're endothermic. They can generate their own body heat, so they're not limited. If it's a cold environment, they don't have to try to sun themselves. They can warm themselves up. They can do it on their own and maintain their body temperature. Now, the drawback to this, by the way, is they have to eat a lot more. 80% of their energy goes to keeping them warm. So that's why it's kind of a misnomer when they say somebody eats like a bird, because technically birds eat a lot, because reptiles don't need to eat as much. I've had snakes where you could feed them once every 2 weeks. If you fed a bird once every 2 weeks, it would die. And that's because it needs more energy, because it uses that energy to maintain its body temperature. But maintaining the body temperature allows it to move to more places. Birds also need lots of energy, the ones that fly, for flight. So they actually, being endothermic, having the 4-chambered heart that separates the oxygen, that's a huge benefit for flying. They stay warm for flying. But they do actually need quite a bit of energy. Now, for digestion, birds do not chew their food. They have beaks. All birds have beaks and feathers and the hollow bones. And so they have a crop and a gizzard, which the earthworm actually had. So the crop comes first. This stores the food. I actually had a parrot a long time ago. I got it as a baby, and he didn't have feathers yet, and you could actually see that crop. When you would feed him, you'd feed him with a syringe, like a dropper, and this would fill up, and you'd see this big swollen crop. And then it would go to the gizzard, which would grind up the food. Some suggest that our appendix is like the leftover of what used to be a gizzard. Anyway, so 4-chambered heart, hollow bones, they have the ability to fly, they lay hard-shelled eggs, and they offer extended parental care to their chicks. So this is, again, another advancement over the reptiles. Reptiles, most of them, a few of them watch their chicks, but most of them, they lay their eggs and they leave. So birds typically stick around, which is going to ensure the babies are more likely to survive. Although I don't know about some of the ducks around my neighborhood, because they start off with like 18 babies, and like after a week there's like 3. So you have to really wonder what's happening there. But if you think about it, if you give extended parental care to the young are more likely to make it, versus say a turtle or a snake that lays 100 eggs in a nest and leaves. Those eggs can get eaten. They can get eaten by predators as soon as they hatch. So this is another advancement, is birds offering extended parental care. The Archaeopteryx is a link between the reptiles and the birds. He couldn't fly, but he actually had claws on his wings. He could go from tree to tree. And so he was kind of like a dinosaur that shows bird-like characteristics. We think that early on the bird's feathers were more for insulation and courtship, and then later, became adapted for flight.